I'm Joe Graves, and I'm one of the pastors at Central Avenue United Methodist Church in Athens, Ohio, and we're in the process of launching a new church in Columbus, Ohio called Central City Church. Whenever in spaces like this, whether it's a theater or an art studio, I can't help but imagine what God would do if we used that space to launch a new church. I grew up in a traditional church with stained glass windows and pews, and when my dad was a pastor, and even my first appointment in the United Methodist Church was in a traditional church building. But even in that space, I remember going into the sanctuary and walking between the pews as the light came down and just beginning to pray, God, I'm telling people that you're gonna show up, and I'm just trusting that you will. Similar to what we learned about in the breakthrough prayer, what they call a threshold prayer. Just, God, your will be done without limitations. In a lot of ways, that prayer began to shape my calling as I began to realize that God can do anything, that God can do far more than we could ever think or imagine, that if we show up with all that we have and we trust God with all of our heart, that God can do literally the impossible. And that forced me to ask the question, and me and my wife to wrestle with, if God can do anything, what would God do with us?
My whole life, I wanted to rely on God above everything else. I wanted to find that thing where I couldn't rely on people, I couldn't rely on the things that I had, on my own strength, but that beyond everything else, God would provide and God would be there, and I knew that it was only God. And when we began to pray about church planting, I realized that this was the thing that got us there, that we would have to rely on God to provide a location. We didn't have a building, that we didn't know people where we were moving to. We didn't know how God was going to provide financially, or even the city that we were going to be in at first. All of these things were almost exciting because I knew that I couldn't do it on my own, that God had to show up.
In fact, we have 11 things that we know that God, they're like Archer prayers. We know God has to show up in these ways in order to launch a church. So from the very beginning, we began to build a prayer team to ask God to plead on our behalf, to pray. And we've invited people from Athens and Columbus and all over Ohio, and even the country, friends, family, colleagues, mentors, to join this prayer team. And over the season of this last Lent, for 40 days, we'd sent out 11 different emails asking for these 11 specific prayer requests. And God has been hearing those prayers and has been answering them, sometimes on the very day that the email goes out, where people are praying for a location. We get a phone call and says, here, this location's available, or resources are showing up, doors are opening. In this whole journey of feeling a call to plant a church and building a team and then seeing God do miraculous things, I just realized there's such a big difference between believing in some theoretical way that God responds to prayers and actually seeing God respond to prayers.
We didn't know what we were getting into. We didn't know the people that were just going to almost appear like God had already been preparing them for this season of their life as well. We didn't realize the extent of the relationships and how we are going to find our location. And over again, as we've been praying for these specific things, God has provided in a timely way, and just the time that we needed it and the time that we were praying for it. And it's just been an incredible experience to witness God's work in and through us, that without His strength and without God working, we wouldn't be able to do any of this.
Everyone told us that planting a church would be the hardest thing that we ever do, and in a lot of ways, it's been very difficult. But putting ourselves in a place where we have to rely on God has been the most rewarding experience we can ever imagine. And I would invite anyone, whatever God is calling you to, and I'm confident God's calling you to something. It might not be planting a church, but whatever God's calling you to, I pray that it's big enough, and I know that it is, that you will have to rely on God more than anything else, that you'll have to begin and start and end, and through the whole process, prayer will be the center of it. Time spent talking with God, pleading with God, trusting in God.